Welcome to the Autism Blueprint Podcast. I'm your host, Janine Hershkovitz, and it's my goal to help you create a more peaceful home while living with autistic and neurodivergent loved ones. Each episode, we focus on a different room in the house and help you create a peace plan for your home. So let's get started. Hey friends, welcome to the Autism Blueprint Podcast. Before we get started with today's episode, I want to remind you our most current episodes are on our new YouTube channel. And so you can watch as well as listen if you prefer. Our YouTube handle is at Autism Blueprint, so we're easy to find. And as always, I will link to it in the show notes. And if you're already watching us on our YouTube channel, welcome. We are so glad you're here. So today, my guest is Kari Baker. Kari has transitioned from a successful career in corporate finance to becoming a passionate advocate for families with neurodivergent children. And in this episode, she shares her personal journey as a mother to her son, Brady, who was diagnosed with autism. She discusses the early signs of his developmental differences, the challenges that she faced upon receiving his diagnosis, and the importance of early evaluation and early intervention. Kari also highlights the vital role of family support in her journey and addresses the societal perceptions and stigmas surrounding autism. She also talks about her newly published book. It's called Finding Kind, which aims to empower parents to recognize the gifts and talents of their neurodivergent children. Kari also reflects on her personal faith journey and how it has shaped her perspective on parenting and advocacy. So join us as we explore Kari's journey filled with inspiration, practical insights, reminding us that while the path may be challenging, and I know you guys know this well, there's always hope and support available. So let's dive in. Well, Kari Baker, thank you so much for coming on the Autism Blueprint podcast today. How are you?
I'm doing wonderful. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you. I want to start out by digging into how you transitioned from your life in corporate America to what you're doing now. Tell us a little about that.
I really took a 180-degree turn. I've been telling people this is like version 2 of Kari Baker's career life, but I had always wanted to be in finance. I mean, I loved wearing the little business suits, and I just thought that business was always where I was going to be. And I was always in the planning side of it. So I was a certified financial planner. I was a 401k consultant for companies. So I would go in and help them manage their 401k and then educate their employees on retirement planning. So I have always just had this thing for knowing a plan, setting it, having it actually come to fruition, and loving all of that. But I had my son when I was almost 40. And as it happens with just about every parenting experience, that throws all of your wonderful plans right out the window, right? So
Yes, it does.
there's all control is gone. So and it really, from the standpoint of my career side, impacted me from the timing standpoint. So I felt like I wanted to be giving more time to parenting and less time to being out at meetings and traveling for business and that sort of thing. But it really started to get impactful when my son was about 2 years old. We started to notice some differences in his development compared to some of the other kids that we were seeing him around. And honestly, I didn't know any better because I didn't have any other children. I had not been around a lot of children, so I really didn't have any guidepost to compare my son to. But we did start noticing that at play dates, he just didn't want to be around the other kids. He would run off into the other room or bolt out the door, and I would be chasing him down. And I used to joke that I needed to get a babysitter for play dates because all the moms got to get around and talk and gossip and bond and do all those things. And I was always chasing after Brady, so I never got to experience that. And then he had some very intense interests that we thought were a little unique. He loved the Wiggles, and that's not a problem in and of itself. But instead of just listening to the shows on the TV, he would set out the DVD covers in rows on our ottoman.
That sounds familiar.
Does it? Is it hitting a chord?
It
That one
is.
hits a chord with a lot of parents that I talk
Yes.
to.
And the Wiggles. What is it about the Wiggles, right?
Is it isn't that funny? He wouldn't
Yeah.
watch, my son would not watch any other show until he was 2, and
Mhm.
somebody recommended The Wiggles because I just needed 5 minutes to myself. I'm like,
Mhm.
all these parents sit their kid in front of the TV and they can go and take a shower or do whatever, and Brady was not interested in TV until The Wiggles. And then, man, it took hold and it grabbed on tight, but he would stare at the DVD covers, and then he wanted to pull out the little insets that are underneath the clear covers. If you know what people who are younger and all they ever do is stream, they're not going to understand this conversation. But
Right.
anyway, so I would take those insets out, and Brady would want me to cut out little parts of them so that he could carry them around like little treasures. And I thought it was a little odd, but again, not having a bar to measure, I didn't think anything of it. But preschool was when things really started to be more apparent to me. So he cried every single day when I would take him to school.
Mm.
And the teachers assured me 5 minutes later he was fine. But when he was in the 3s, he had some amazing teachers that would send an email every single day with 50 or 60 pictures of everything that they did during the day at school.
Wow.
And I know it was incredible. And I started looking at the pictures though. And when the rest of the class was in circle time, Brady was in the back of the classroom rolling around on his back.
Yeah.
And when they were out on the playground and all the kids were playing on the equipment, Brady was just kind of sitting off by himself to the side. And I showed him the pictures one day and I said, "Can you show me your friends?" And he didn't know any of the kids' names. And this is
Mm.
after he had already been in school with them for over a year. He had been in the 2s and now the 3s. So it all kind of started to rein in on me a little bit that something just needed to be looked at. Something wasn't typical. He wasn't in the same realm. I remember going to a birthday party and there was a little boy and he got hurt. He was on a skateboard or something and fell off and got hurt. And my husband and I were standing there and his mom said, "Well, are you okay?" And he said, "No, mommy, I am not okay." And John and I just looked at each other and we said, "Oh my gosh, that was a complete sentence. Brady doesn't talk like that." So
Mhm.
there were all of these little things. And so I came home one day and I tried to get back to work and I just couldn't concentrate. And there was a magazine sitting in front of me and I'd never opened this magazine before. I don't even know how it made it into my office versus just the recycle bin. But it's one of these local charity type magazines that shows all the pictures of the galas and stuff like that. And I was just distracted and I picked it up and I started flipping through it. And there was an article in that magazine written by a woman named Patty Dion. And Patty Dion had a son named Dave who was actually diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, but not until much later in his life, until he was in his early 20s.
Mhm.
And they had known something was wrong, but they had never been able to get a diagnosis. They just didn't know how to treat it. And he had a very difficult life out of all of these years, not understanding why his brain worked differently. And as I was reading the description of Dave in the article, it just stopped me in my tracks because it sounded just like Brady. She
Mhm.
was kind of looking back to when he was a toddler and in elementary school. And so many of the things just were spot on to the way that Brady had been behaving and responding. So at the bottom of that article, there was a link to a quiz called thinkaspergers.com. And it was an organization Patty Dion started. And I went online and I took that quiz, and every single question, there were only 15, but every single question was yes. And I clicked the button to submit my answers, and it popped up that you should have your child evaluated for autism spectrum disorder.
Mm. What was
And
that like for you? I just want to interrupt you for a minute. The
no, yeah.
therapist in me wants to know what that was like in that moment for you.
It was funny. I was completely devastated, first of all, because I didn't know anything about autism. Not one thing. I did not know one person with it. I didn't have a friend who had a child with autism. It was this completely unknown thing sitting out there, with the exception of a couple like really scary news articles that I had heard about autism, right?
Yeah.
So I was completely devastated. But at the same time, I did not go through denial. I mean, I knew 100% in my mind, this is exactly what Brady has. This is why all these things are different about him. And so it's funny, I lived 3 blocks from my parents, and my mom happened to call me right when I went through that questionnaire, and she could
Mm.
tell that I was not okay. And she sent
Mhm.
my dad over, and he was at my door 3 minutes later and just holding me and hugging me. And I let myself just collapse into it, but only for about 15 minutes. I was like, okay, this is what it is. I'm picking
Mhm.
myself up off the floor. This is
Mhm.
kind of my corporate business thing. Okay, now we know what it is. What are we going to do about it?
Yes.
And
Yes.
I just went in full on action mode, researching things online, figuring out what kind of things I was going to tell my husband when he got home from work, because I was a little afraid that he was going to say, "Oh, Kari, he's 3. This isn't autism. This is just him, being a 3-year-old." But so I prepared my arguments for my husband. Fortunately, he was 100% on board and agreed as soon as he got home. But from that point forward, it was just about, we're running a race to see, how much help we can get our son as young as he is to try to make
Mhm.
the biggest impact.
Mhm.
But, we ran into waiting lists, we ran into closed doors. We kept getting the message, go as fast as you can to help as much as you can when they're younger. And then we would run into a brick wall because we just couldn't get access to it.
Yes.
So it was very frustrating. It was very, it was something that my husband and I made a conscious decision at the time to not tell anybody about. We told my
Mhm.
parents and some very close friends. I did tell my business partner because
Mhm.
I knew that my schedule was going to be impacted by all the different therapies and appointments that we were going to go to. Um, but we decided we were just going to put our heads down, go as fast as we can. And we kind of put this circle of silence around us that wound up being kind of destructive, at least for me personally, because I would put on the happy face in front of everybody. Our
Mm.
son was able to get an aide in preschool. And so other parents would say, well, why does Brady have an aide? And I would just say, oh, he's just got a few developmental delays we're trying to work through, and I wouldn't even bring it up.
Yeah.
And it wasn't because I was ashamed of my son either. I want to make that clear. It was just, we had this fear of what other people's reaction would be. I didn't want other parents saying, "Oh, they can't play with Brady Baker because Brady Baker has autism."
Yeah.
Um, my husband was in the military, and he said, "Well, what if he wants to be in the military? Will they even let him in? We don't know." Like it was
Mhm.
just all of this unknown and all of this fear,
Mhm.
and it took several years, probably until we were 3 or 4 years into the diagnosis, when I really started leaning into my faith, when I really started seeing Brady for all the gifts and talents that he has instead of all the really hard things that we were going through. Not that I didn't see the hard things anymore, but I started to realize that he was made exactly the way he was supposed to be made, and all of those things are a part of who he is.
Mm.
So
That's
that
beautiful.
but that is a really long way of answering your question about my
Yes.
career
No.
shift. Sorry.
That's okay. I know that you're an autism mommy, so I figured it would be a long
Yes.
story.
Well,
So
and I
when
used
uh-huh,
go
go
ahead.
ahead. Oh, I was just wondering, the shift that you made was creating, well, I'm assuming kindfamilies.com is your website. Tell me
Correct.
how that came about. Did that come before the book or after? How'd that go down?
Well, it did, although it really wasn't activated. So in about 2018, I had started leaning into faith a little bit. I was going to a Bible study, and a woman was hearing all of my stories that I was gushing out to all these strange women around the table. And she said, you ought to write a book. And it was a little bit off putting because I said, well, I'm a finance person, I'm not a writer. But I started thinking about it, and I started to think, gosh, when I was going through this, I couldn't find a book that was the personal stories and that showed me that I wasn't alone, and that
Mm.
showed me that things that my son were doing weren't these completely, off the wall things that other kids whose brains worked similarly, experienced life the same way. So I sat down in 2018 and I actually started writing. And I mean, it was a brain dump. I was just
Yeah.
putting everything down. And unfortunately, it was just a lot of the hard stuff. It was a lot of the hard stories about school and about other
Mhm.
families and about feeling isolated and all of those things. And it was that point that kind came to me because I was talking about the fact that, Brady looks just like every other kid that's walking out on the street, but there are some definite differences in the way he is receiving the world and then processing his response to the world.
Mhm.
And so this invisible nature of the type of neurodiversity that Brady has was causing some issues just in the fact that, there wasn't as much grace given in a lot of those situations.
Yes.
Especially with strangers, but sometimes even with people that we did know. And
Mhm.
so the invisible nature of invisible neurological differences kind of came together with this is my kid with invisible neurological differences. And kind of came to mind, and I talked to my husband about it and I got the website domain. But when my husband read all the stuff that I'd written, he said, this just makes it sound like it's really hard to be Brady's mom. And that was a gut punch. And I said, well, that is the last thing I want him to think or anybody else to think.
Yeah.
I don't want anybody to believe that I think Brady is anything but the greatest joy that has ever been given to me. So I just stopped writing. I had the website domain. I didn't do anything with it.
Mhm.
And it was really, and this is where I'm finally going to come around and answer your question about the career change. But it was in 2022 when I just really started feeling pulled away from corporate life and from going to these meetings and talking about the same things. And I was starting to really embrace all of the blessings that we're seeing in Brady. And so I went and I talked to my partner at the time and I said, I'm thinking we need to have an exit strategy out of this partnership and the business that we should start thinking about. And I was thinking like 5 years down the road. And as it turns out, she had been thinking the same thing. And later that year, we got an opportunity to sell the practice, and she stayed on with the company that bought our company. And I had the opportunity to just step back and really try to focus on how can I take this concept of kind families and take all of these one-on-one conversations I've been having with moms for the last 10 years, really, because every time somebody was suspecting a diagnosis or was having trouble with their kid, they would say, call Kari. And I'd go and I'd have coffee with this person. And we'd sit there for 3 hours and talk. And my
Mhm.
husband said, well, maybe there's a way you can reach more of these people in a more, time efficient manner. And then, by that point, thankfully, my mindset had changed to the point where the stories weren't just about the hard things. They were about the fact that a lot of the hard things I was going through were because of my own mindset that needed to be changed, and that I
Mm.
was failing to recognize all of the gifts and talents that my son was displaying. And so the story got very different. And the book, as it stands today, it does have the hard stories in it. It has, the first part is the awakening to it. And the second part is adapting. And there are hard pieces of that. There's isolation. There's this shame that I was talking about that I should have been able to create this kid that had this perfect life because I'm a planner and that's what I do. And my plans happen. And it was letting go of that. And then the whole last section of the book, which couldn't have been written because it hadn't happened yet, but it's
Yeah.
all about Brady and all the amazing things that he's done, all the challenges he's faced and overcome, the impact that he's had on all the people around him and how he's made their life better. And it just became a story of encouragement and hope. I hope that's the impact that I want to have with families that just have a kid whose brain is wired differently. And so that's
Nice.
my very long answer to your
I love
question about a
that.
career
Well,
change.
and I don't know if we talked about this. Yeah, I don't think we did. What does KIND is an acronym. What does it
Yes.
stand for?
Kids with invisible neurological differences.
Love
So
that.
Yeah.
And
So,
the
and
fact that it
it
spelled the
comes,
word kind, was that
I
just like
know.
an aha moment for
It
you?
was. It was. I didn't know what to do with it for several years, but
Yeah.
it was. And the more conversations that I have with families too, it's not just autism. My son also has ADHD and a couple of other neurological things. I call it, ingredients in his neurological soup.
Mhm.
But it's, dyslexia, it's sensory processing disorder. There's so many different things, different diagnoses that you can have that kind of manifest themselves in very similar ways with kids, with social problems with other kids in school and peers, with executive function issues on being able to manage homework and organization and those kinds of things. And
Mhm.
it doesn't necessarily even mean that you have to have this diagnosis in your hand to say that you have a kind kid, because there are so many different things that can be going on with kids and adults for that matter, in the way their brain is wired, how they best learn, how they best receive information, how they're able to communicate. And so it really kind of runs the gamut of, gosh, you look like everybody else, but your brain is wired differently.
Oh,
So,
100%. I can relate, Carrie, so much to your story, except that mine happened in the early 2000s. So my son was
mm,
diagnosed in 2001. And,
right.
I whenever I talk to, younger parents, and now they're all younger than me, by the way, um, they're I never want it to sound like, "Well, back in my day, it was so much
Right,
harder.
right.
We barely had the internet." But,
Right, right.
but I feel like nowadays, with the internet and with so much information, right? There's
Mm,
there's so much to I guess read and
yeah.
watch, and you don't really know what you can trust. And how did you navigate all of that? I mean, did you do like the
Mm.
Google deep dives at 3 in the morning like most of us moms do? How did you do it?
We did it all. And we did some, I will admit, first up, that we did some questionable things because I was
Yeah.
so hungry for the answers, especially in the
Yes.
early years, that we did the internet research. My husband actually went to the library. Like, he wants to hold a book in his hand. And so he came home with these stacks of therapy type books
Mhm.
that a therapist would get and use in working with their kids, and we would start to put those into practice in our home.
Mhm.
I'd be sitting in a waiting room at speech or OT, and there would be another mom there, and she would say, "Oh, we went to so and so, and we really noticed a difference." And so, man, I'd sign up with so and so and would give
Yeah.
it a try. It was a lot of throwing the spaghetti up against the wall and seeing if it would stick.
Yes.
And some of those things, I look back on, and Brady, we actually laugh about it now. There were some nutty things that I made him go through. And nothing
I'm with you.
physical that would have hurt him, but things that
I'm
he did
with
not
you.
appreciate.
Yes. Yes.
So, but there wasn't the YouTube, um, you know, file library of all the video stuff. But one of the really cool things that happened, I talk about how autism has impacted my family and people close to Brady. My
Mhm.
sister, who's 4 years older than I am, she and Brady were just best friends. I still are. They're on a FaceTime call as we speak because they just love each other so much. But when she found out about his diagnosis, she started making these videos for him that encompassed concepts that he was struggling with, like more or less, or big problem, small problem, and all of these kind of therapy points that we were trying to go through with him. And she'd do these silly videos, and she'd put on the funny hats, and she'd get her stuffed animals involved and put little stickers on the screen. And he would watch those over and over and over again and just laugh himself silly. But they were all impacting something that we were working on at that time. So, um, it was just a team effort. I will say too that one of the things that we learned early on in one of the parenting classes that we took is consistency is key.
Mhm.
So we would do a weekly newsletter that we would send out to all of his teachers, his therapists, my family, John's family, my husband's family, basically babysitters, anybody that was going to be spending time with Brady, we would say, okay, these are the things we're working on this week. And these are the things that if he does this, you need to respond this way, and make sure that everybody was really on the same page across the board, so that we weren't unwinding some of the hard work that he was doing and some of the therapies that he was in, when he goes over to grandma's house or something like that. So, so that was another important thing for us, is just getting the whole team on board.
Yes. Well, and it sounds like you had a team from the get-go as far as supportive family. You mentioned your sister, you mentioned your parents living nearby. I had the pleasure of listening to your podcast this morning where you had Brady, who's 13 now, on as a guest. And oh my goodness, I was just so touched. And I'm going to link to that in the show notes, that specific episode, because parents out there, you have to hear this kiddo just, he expresses himself so clearly and beautifully. And I mean, he just reminds me so much of the kiddos that we see in my practice, who are just light years beyond, in a lot of ways, beyond their peers.
Yes.
But in other ways, not so much, right? So I don't know if we still call them that. We used to call them splinter skills in special education. And it's kind of like it's not linear growth, right? When they're growing, it's more of a in this area they're doing well, and in this area they might still be behind. And there's such a mismatch sometimes. Did you notice those things as well as he was growing up?
Absolutely. He was always a huge reader. I mean, as soon as he learned to read on his own, he was reading. I mean, it was harder to find content that was age appropriate for him, that was, advanced enough for him in reading. He's always been a writer. So my dad, another story of just how other people impacted him, when he was probably 5 or 6 years old, he'd start going over to my dad's house, and he would dictate creative writing stories to my dad, and he would type it out. And my dad uses 2 fingers to type, so it was a long process. But they must have written 150 stories together, and with characters that, like Power Monkey and Hoodie Man, that he would carry on in these series. And so it was really kind of neat. We were sitting at dinner one night when we were talking about the foreword for Finding Kind, and I think it was his idea. He's like, well, maybe I could write the foreword. And I said, well, Brady, that's a great idea. And then deep down, I have to admit, I was like, okay, if it's okay, we'll not make any promises, right?
Right.
We'll see what you come up with. But he literally went into his room and came out, and I read this first draft, and it was perfect. It was exactly what I wanted him to be able to express in his very unique way, using books and movies, which are his 2 favorite things on the planet. So, but like you're saying with the splinter skills, so he's so far beyond in those kind of creative, the writing, the reading, but socially, he is still behind. And fortunately, he's found some really sweet friends that are kind of right along the same path as he is. So, we're in middle school now, and goodness gracious, that is a lot to handle for any kid, much less a neurodivergent kid. And he has experienced, unfortunately, some kids who were not kind to him and who used his autism as something to bully him with. And so he's walking that line. He's the old soul. I've heard a lot of parents of kids with autism say that their kids are kind of like that old soul. He talks like he's an older man. And one time Brady even said to me, he goes, Mom, you don't have to worry about me, because as soon as I become an adult, I'll talk like everybody else and it'll be fine. And I'm like, okay, well, that's pretty good reasoning.
And his insight and his ability to just reflect on those things was just astounding to me. I just hearing him talk in the podcast as well. And we have the same favorite movies. And I'm not going to give away his top 10 movie list, but anything with a John Williams score, I am all about. So
exactly.
I
Oh
100%
my
agreed
goodness.
with his list.
Well, I'll tell him
Um,
that. He might need to call you and talk your ear off about it
yes,
because that's his
please.
favorite
I
thing to
mean,
discuss.
you can just tell him that I saw Star Wars: A New Hope back in, when it came out in the theater.
Me
So,
too. Me
yeah.
too. I'm 53, so I think I was 6 when it came out, and,
Okay.
it's been a family affair.
It cracks me up how our kids, all of our kind kids, seem to have very similar
Mm,
interests. And I don't know, in my mind they always seem to be very creative driven, multi-layered. Like
yes.
I've talked to some kids that love Star Wars because of the story, or they love it because of the character, and others just love the music so much.
Mm,
I was one of those
yeah.
kids. I was all about the music. Story was good. I liked the story. It
Right.
was great. But the music made it for me. Like
Yes.
that was just
Yes.
huge. And, all the toys, action figures and all
You're
of that.
right.
But so Brady would definitely be like my BFF if I were
Oh,
13.
I
For
love
sure.
that.
Oh my gosh. Absolutely. Um, I want to go back to that family support because I
Mm,
think it's so crucial. I had a lot of family support as well when my kids were growing up. Um, what, in addition to like your dad's relationship with him and your sister's relationship, how did that support help you and your husband as
oh.
parents?
Oh gosh. Well, first of all, I mean, I was still working, especially when he was younger, and so I needed help just watching him, so that I could get things done. And they were my parents and my mother-in-law too. They would drop everything at the drop of a hat to come and help us out. The It was a little challenging because a lot of the behaviors that Brady showed only came out with me.
Ah,
So
yes.
there still was some disbelief if my parents witnessed a meltdown, it would shake my dad to the core. And I don't think my dad would be able to sleep for two nights because he
Yes.
didn't really fully understand how things were going at home when it was just the three of us here. So
Mhm.
I think that was super hard for them. But again, that he would just do anything to help him. My mom, it's really interesting because they're in their 80s now. They still live 3 blocks away, and they still are very, very involved in Brady's everyday life. But she's almost, probably because she's a mom, she almost handles those kinds of situations better than my dad does. When if
Mhm.
Brady is hurt, or if Brady is threatened, my mom can kind of take that in stride, but my dad is the one that just feels it to his core.
Oh, we
So
sound like we have very similar parents.
really, oh
Yes.
my gosh. So, and then, my sister she's not married. She's never had kids. And so it was really interesting with her, because she and I were never close. Growing up, we just were different people. And then when we left the house and, went our separate ways, we didn't really communicate. And Brady was the thing that brought us back together. And she, as somebody who'd never been around little kids, just embraced him. And especially once he started talking, she was a little nervous when he was still baby, baby toddler age. But as soon as he could start to talk, I mean, they just became best friends. And so she turned into what we call Auntie Kimberly, that and that was the website that she set up, auntiekimberly.com, with all these videos that she would make for Brady. And so even, she had this stamina for being with him that I didn't even have, because man, when Brady was going to play something, if it was what he wanted to play, he would play it for 4 hours.
Mhm.
And Mama
Mhm.
had about a 15-minute attention span for that stuff. But he would go over to Auntie Kimberly's house, and she would sit there for 4 hours. She would do anything he asked her to do.
Mm.
It just out of, just pure joy and love for him. So I can't fathom how much harder it would have been for us, for my husband and me. If number one, I hear parents all the time talk about the fact that their extended family doesn't even believe that there's anything wrong with
Yes.
their child.
Yes.
And to have to defend, what you're doing to try to help your child in addition to all the other stresses that are put on your marriage and your relationship with your child. I just can't imagine that. And we've just been so incredibly blessed with the family that we have that just rallied around us and continues to do that every day.
Yeah.
So,
Oh, that's so wonderful. I can relate to you on so many levels, but I can now kind of sit back and marvel at all that support that we got, that I don't even think at the time I realized how
mm,
important and kind of rare that
right,
is. Because, in my practice, I see a lot of families who one of their biggest issues is we don't have any family near us that would help. And some of those family members, for some people, they wouldn't even want them to help if they did live
right,
nearby.
right,
So having a healthy relationship with your family lends itself to them believing you
right,
in a lot of
right,
ways, right?
right.
I mean, sometimes people are in that space of denial as a way to protect themselves.
Mm,
And, I've heard about a lot of grandparents that, the parent will say, "Can I bring grandma in so you can talk to them and explain to them why this is a thing?" And what I always find out is it's the grief that's stopping them.
mm, right,
It's just
right.
that sadness. And I remember my mom telling me one time, um, that it's hard for us in a different way because we're watching our grandchild go through this, and then we're watching
Mm,
you, the mom, have to
yes,
struggle as well. So it's like all this love that they feel is now pained.
right.
And for every family it's different. For us, my son had a lot of medical issues in
Mm,
addition to being limited in his verbal capacity, and so behaviors, as they call them,
mhm,
doing that in quotes because I don't see them as behaviors anymore, I see them as
right,
communication. But they were just off the charts, and it
right.
was really affecting us and our household. But you know what, that's what led me to become a therapist and create the podcast and everything else. So it's really cool how these stories are kind of similar. And
Yeah, I've given some talks before, and I said, sometimes that hard thing that you're going through can become your heart thing. And I've seen that so many times with parents of kids, kind kids, any kind of special needs kid. I have friends that went out and got their BCBA license so that they could work with kids, or became a speech pathologist or an occupational therapist, and these kids will grab onto your heart in one way or
Mm.
another. And I am not really gifted in working with any other kid but my own. So I tried serving in the children's ministry at church one time, and they're like, "You're okay. You can go do with children." So
not your thing.
not my thing.
It's
So,
okay.
but it is my passion to help these parents and these families and these grandparents find purpose in everything that is happening with their child, and
Mm.
help them find joy in it. And you can. You it doesn't mean that things aren't still going to be hard. It doesn't mean that you're not going to run into challenges, that you're not going to have bad days. I mean, I certainly never want to put this Pollyanna picture out there that that everything is going to be okay once you change your mindset. That's not the case. But I can always go back to, my kid was made on purpose for a purpose, and there's no mistake in who he is, and he's going to go off and do great things if I can nurture the parts of him that are successful and that he feels confident. And the writing and the he wants to be a movie director. And so, by grace of God, he wound up with a middle school teacher who is a Hollywood screenwriter in his former
Ah,
life. Like, so he's kind of, shepherding Brady a little bit on the movie stuff. So, I just feel like there is so much possibility, and there's so much hope in the workplace, in industries around working with neurodivergent people, and understanding that they might need to be interviewed differently, they might need to be supervised differently. But
mhm.
if you can find the niche where they've got a talent and an ability and an aptitude, they can work wonders for any organization. So
Yes.
there's a lot of future hope too in the way that the world is reacting to the neurodivergent individual. So
Yeah. I love that you said that about not wanting to put a Pollyanna spin. So many of the books written by parents when my son was diagnosed were about severely impacted autistic kids. And when I say severely impacted, y'all don't come after me. I just mean like difficulty speaking, lots of behavior issues, a lot of trouble with, body awareness, all of those things that get in the way. And I gravitated toward all the books about the parents that like cured their kids, right?
mhm,
Whatever that
mhm,
looked like at the time or was
right.
supposed to look like, because I didn't know that he could live a full, abundant life while
Yeah.
being autistic, right?
One
And what I love about your point of view is that you're saying, yes, this is, it's been hard, but it's been good for our family as well. But
Mhm.
you're not just taking the situation and sprinkling pixie dust on it and saying, oh, we're just going to choose to be happy. You really
Right.
have found it.
Right.
And it's
Right.
so beautiful. Tell me a little bit about your faith progression and how that has been affected.
Oh, sure. So, I mean, I grew up Presbyterian, so I was kind of filled with more book knowledge on faith than anything else.
Mhm.
And then certainly in my 20s and 30s, I was about as far away from God as I could be. I had a lot of fun in my 20s, especially. Um, so when I started going through this, I really didn't have a strong faith at all. When Brady was diagnosed, I had a very hard time seeing any purpose in it. And I really kind of felt like I had been robbed of this parenting experience that
Yes.
I thought I deserved because I thought I did everything right. I did everything right.
Yes,
I
yes,
checked all the
yes.
boxes. Why didn't I have this perfectly typical child that is going to live this perfectly typical life? And I really started getting pulled into church. I just feel like God started saying, if you want to figure this out, here's where you need to go. And so I
Mhm.
started going to church. The sermon started getting to me, and then I decided to go to a Bible study, which I have to tell you was a crazy thing for me to think to do. So my friends, especially my friends from college, were like, "You're going to a Bible study?"
You're going, "Where?"
And I know it's all old ladies with, Afghans and rocking chairs. I don't know. But I'm searching for something that I can't find. And what wound up happening is I found a group of women who had a very deep faith that I found I wanted.
Mhm.
And the more I studied, and the more I really dove into um, all of our purpose. And I felt like I got my release when I read a verse in John 9 that said, his disciples were walking by a blind man. And the disciples said, Jesus, was this man born blind? Was it his sin or was it his parents' sin? And that hit me like a ton of bricks. And that was kind of the light bulb moment for me where all of this pain that I was putting myself through and all this frustration and this isolation and everything else was because I felt like I had done something wrong and I had
Yeah,
caused this to
yeah,
happen. But what the response is that neither the man nor his parents sinned. He was born this way to show the glory of God. And I was seeing that in my son. He's got a deep faith as well, which I didn't think was really an option for somebody with autism. Again, I got the book smarts on autism, and
yeah.
faith is very intangible. It must be a very hard thing for somebody with a brain like my son's, but he has a faith. And that just kind of was the beginning of me continuing to deep dive into it. And I wound up, I'm a backup vocalist on my worship team. Another thing I never thought in a million years I would
Good for
do. I
you.
didn't even tell my husband when I went to go audition for it because I thought it was so crazy. But here I am. And I really feel like kind was something that was put in my lap to do for a purpose to help others with the same situation that I went through, and hopefully coming to terms with it a little bit sooner than I did, because it took me several years of a lot of pain and frustration until I got there. So
Mhm, mhm. Oh, that's such a lovely story. And, I I have been in different circles in churches, and when my kids were growing up, we attended a Methodist church, and they were amazing,
mm,
amazing support. for our children. It was really wonderful. But I'm so I find your take on it and your perspective so refreshing and so non-legalistic,
Mm,
which is
right.
really, really lovely, because some of that legalism is kind of what really bothered me after a while. And I had to
Right.
just kind of take my own faith and make it like personal. My husband is Jewish, but he
Yeah.
isn't practicing. So we just kind of had to create our own idea of like who God is and what we want to teach our kids, um,
Right.
and things like that. So it is an interesting journey, and purpose always comes in there. You used that word before. Do you
Yeah.
feel like you have found your purpose, and what would you say that is?
I 100% have found it. I think I talk about in the book as well that we're all given gifts and talents, not just our kids. We are
Mhm.
all given gifts and talents. And when you start to use them in the way that you were intended, it can fill you with a tremendous amount of joy and peace. So,
Mhm.
for instance, the worship team thing, I thought I was crazy for doing it, but the first time that I led worship in my church, I felt completely filled. I felt completely
Mm.
filled up. And the same with every kind conversation that I've had with another mom where I feel like I brought them peace. The talks that I give, I talk at schools, I talk at churches, I talk at other organizations, charitable organizations, and somebody will come up and say, that I needed to hear that today, and so with the podcast, just like you, I feel like I'm able to bring these voices into families that might not otherwise get to hear them, getting to
Mhm.
meet all of these amazing people who have really dedicated their lives to helping kind
Mm.
kids. And it's so inspiring. So it's funny. For after 30 years in the finance business, I can't even stomach it anymore. I
The
mean, it's
finance
like
stuff.
that's how I know that I'm in the right place too, because I
Mhm.
actually got a consulting offer to go back and do some consulting work in the industry. And I kind of felt like, okay, I'm just getting this started. This is a self-published book. So, we put a lot of resources into it. I should just take the job. And I started to sign up for it, and it was making me sick to my stomach. And I told my husband, and he's like, well, then don't do it. And I feel like that was my confirmation in my release that part of my life is behind me. Now there's a
Mhm.
lot of lessons I can still share with people from all the 30 years that I was there, especially with special needs and kind families. But it is really, for me right now, it is about encouragement and hope. And I do hope that and plan that down the road, when and we get a little bit further along, that we will have a 501(c)(3), and we'll be able to
Nice.
provide some real resources for families in places like maybe churches or community events and those kinds of things, with people who can help those parents go and enjoy those facilities and things with a little bit of help with somebody who's trained.
Mhm.
And so, and also really encouraging the early evaluation and
Mhm.
early identification.
Yes.
I think that has been transformational for Brady, and it breaks my heart to see families not go get that information that they need to help their kids. And I see it over and over again. And whatever the reasoning is, not wanting a label or whatever that is, I just feel like they are preventing that child from being the best and most productive kid that they can be by putting that off. So that's another
Yes.
big passion of mine. So,
Yes. Yes. Diagnosis is important,
mhm.
just for so many reasons, but I love that. Gosh, I could talk to you all day, but I will
Me
not. I
too.
want to be respectful of your time.
Oh.
The last question, that I ask everyone is, if every kind parent were listening, what would you want them
Mhm.
to know?
Oh, well, it's my mantra. Your kid was made on purpose for a purpose, and there's no mistake in that. And also, find community. there is something so powerful about whether it's listening to a podcast or even on a Facebook Autism Mom page, or a cup of coffee with some other moms from the same therapist that your kid goes to. Finding community and somebody who can speak your language is going to fill your bucket and help you get through all of those hard things, because you'll know you're not alone, and you're not. So.
I love that. On that note, Kari, I will link to everything, including your book, in the show notes and your podcast. And just thank you
Wonderful.
so much for coming on today.
Thank you so much for having me. I love the conversation as well.
The information in this podcast is not intended to be a substitute for help from a licensed mental health professional.